So fair warning, this has taken more like 90 minutes. Pat was here. That's getting into dinner time, so I'm going to try to move it along. But we'll see. I've been saying, you all know I like to do things Socratically, but when I'm trying to cover everything, I can't really do a lot of question and answer. If you want me to stop, if you want to say something, you are welcome to, but I'm going to keep plowing through, but it's perfectly fine to stop and ask questions or figure out, explain something more, but I need you to raise your hand or yell at me, because I'm trying to cover a lot.
I do know your speech picked up.
Yeah, oh yeah, once I see the time, it's going to pick up. So, was there something else I was going to say? And then obviously, when you're covering this much history, I'm going to make some generalizations. There's probably some things I'm totally wrong about, but I'm trying my best, and we can always dig into stuff more deeply if it interests us. And where's my water? I'm going to put it up here. So, sometime around the year 35, Jesus is raised from the dead. We do not have one unified church springing out of Jesus' resurrection. First of all, the church would have understood itself to be a sect of Judaism. If you were a follower of Jesus, you were part of a Jewish religion, sect, side party until probably at least until the temple is destroyed in 70. Probably a little bit after that, until they start to realize they're their own thing. We can see in our Bible, Paul arguing with people who say you should be law observant, and him saying you don't need to be law observant, and all these things. Really, when you're talking about what people believe and what they practice, everything is kind of a mess. You have the orthodoxy of a church and the things that people are actually doing and believing. For many years, and probably still to this day, there are Methodists who will not baptize children. Especially around here, especially in sort of the mid-20th century. There was what was in the book and what people were really doing. And that's just as true right when Christianity is starting. We have Ethiopian Christianity, which goes all the way probably back to apostles or early Christians, that was never associated with the Catholic Church of any kind. You have Egyptian Christianity and all sorts of different, so there's sort of a big cloud. It's, sometimes in church history they'll draw the one line and show you the breaks, and that's not really how it works, and not even really how it works now. But coming out of that, you do have what we would call the Catholic Church coalescing over, your councils of Nicaea, your councils of Chalcedon, these big councils where they decide what books are in the Bible, what do we believe about Jesus, what do we believe about the Trinity, and all these things. You have the Catholic Church is what's doing those things. They have a system of bishops over certain areas. They have celibate clergy and established creeds and liturgy of some kind. I shouldn't say that. I don't actually know about that time. Because what happens in the year 1000 is you have the split between East and West, what we would call Orthodox Christianity and Catholic, Roman Catholic. There are theological things going on. There's this thing called the Filioque about whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son or something like that. Really, I think historically the bigger division at that time was people in the East spoke Greek and people in the West spoke Latin. And they had a lot of trouble talking to each other, and so they split off. From and in the East, I'm not an expert, but you end up with Eastern Orthodoxy, but also Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, various Ukrainian Orthodox, various different branches from that. In the West, you have the Roman Catholic Church doing some of its own reforming and things. You could talk about the Franciscans, but really the first break is, Martin Luther coming up to the church and nailing the 95 Theses, especially arguing against works righteousness, or the idea that salvation comes through works, through the I think the reason he caused a big stir is he's really saying, you don't need the church to be saved. I mean, that's his, at least practically, what really got a lot of people upset, was he says, the church exists for a reason, but you don't need to be part of the church to be saved. You just have to have faith in Jesus. He has other things that are really important. Again, language comes into play. He's saying people should read the Bible in the vernacular. At that point, you'd have peasants sitting in the pews that have no idea about Latin, they can't understand Latin, and they have no clue what's happening. And so once you start translating the Bible and people can actually read it or hear it spoken in their own language, people start to say, well, wait a minute, what about what Paul says in Galatians, and things like that. So you have Luther, who incites the whole Reformation, emphasizing salvation by faith, emphasizing basically fracturing the power of the Catholic Church in many ways for different theological, linguistic, and other reasons. Do y'all know about Henry VIII? Henry VIII is actually a pretty devout Catholic, but he wants to get a divorce, and the Pope doesn't want him to get a divorce. So he basically takes Catholic belief, Catholic liturgy, Catholic practices, puts them in English, and copies them over to what's then called the Church of England. I should say Eastern Orthodox priests eventually can get married. That's another thing with the Reformation, is ending that celibacy of the priesthood, and in fact, an understanding of the priesthood of all believers. That is, everyone is a minister of God, and there's not a special category of priesthood in the same way, although we still have ordination of some kind and an understanding of calling. That's a side point. The Church of England is interesting because it was and is very Catholic in some ways. If you step in, there are a lot of people who decide to leave the Roman Catholic Church and make an easy transition to Episcopalian or Anglicanism because the liturgy and the practices, and it's very, the high church chanting and things like that basically carry over. But theologically, they do start to have some influence from the Reformation. Some articles regarding salvation by faith, the vernacular, obviously, and various other influences coming over in the Church of England. So even though it is, if we were tracing from the Catholic, the Reformation would be over here, and it's kind of its own branch. But these people in the Church of England are reading all the Martin Luther and Melanchthon and all these scholars writing in Europe during the Reformation. John and Charles Wesley die as Anglicans. They never leave the Church of England, although some people said they should. And the only church, Methodist church, that is founded during their lifetime is in what becomes the United States, because we fight a war with England, and when you're fighting a war, the church that is directly connected to the country you're fighting a war against, not always easy, and there are other reasons for that too, which we'll get to. But I have been saying the Church of England, the context in which they're born that is a church that is literally sponsored and supported by the government, by the monarchy. I mean, your taxes would partially and may still support the work of the church. The king or queen is technically the head of that church. This is what the Pilgrims are fleeing from, and the Quakers and other things. You could be another Christian, another kind of Christian, maybe another religion, in Britain at that time, but you were actually paying taxes to be that, and were very often, especially in when it came to Catholics, also being persecuted depending on who the king was. So, all that to say, when you have a state religion, mostly everyone is kind of a part of church. There is a sort of cultural Christianity where every town has a priest and maybe everyone goes to church sometimes. But what John and Charles Wesley really contribute in the Methodist revival is it's not enough just to be a Christian in name, to sort of be on the rolls in a church and maybe go there sometimes, that the Christian life involves genuinely living faith in Jesus Christ and then responding to God's grace with faithful action, right? So they're saying it's not enough that you were baptized as a kid and maybe you profess some nominal Christianity. We want to pursue this. We want to transform our lives in the image of God, right? They start this with what's called the Holy Club, so they're at Oxford, and there's a group of them that meet very regularly. They meet once a week. They fast every week on Wednesdays. They say a prescribed amount of prayers. They're genuinely trying to become more holy. And even all these people training to be priests at Oxford say, you all are going too far. You're taking this too seriously. That's a little too much Jesus for us. I mean, that's why they're called Methodists, because, they were praying these particular prayers and doing these particular fasts in a very structured way to try to become more holy. And so it was actually initially a pejorative term. It was used to make fun of this group of people. One of the other people in this group, along with John and Charles Wesley, they are, by the way, the sons of a priest, and their mother also has been noted. She has some writings and some prayers, was a very faithful person and a reader, I think, of some of these more Reformation texts and things. I mean, the smart people who write about Wesley talk about her influence on them in their eventual pursuit of holiness. So their mother, Susanna, is very important historically. John Wesley tries to go be a missionary, actually goes to the United States around Savannah and tries to evangelize to the Native Americans and start a church. He makes some people mad. I think he may have had a romance with I wish I'd looked this up, with someone very important's daughter, and then something happened and he got into trouble and left. Basically, this whole missionary thing was a failure. I have to look up the story on that. When he comes back, he starts to hang out with the Moravians. Do you all know the Moravians? Mm-hmm. There's a bunch of them in Winston-Salem. Historically was a settlement. The Moravians kind of stem from it's German in origin, I think, and sort of stem from that Reformation thing to the point where their emphasis is on salvation by faith, and they sort of just sit around and pray and wait to get saved. And part of what they say is, and this is from a Methodist perspective, so it might not be totally generous, but once you have this experience of being saved, you can no longer sin. You are unable to sin. You've been saved, and you respond in faith, and you're good to go. So you pray for that to happen, pray for Jesus to come into your heart, and then you're all set. So Wesley is hanging out with them and praying and singing and reading scripture, and he has this experience you may have heard, his sort of conversion, where he says, I felt my heart strangely warmed. Right? I felt that Jesus died for me, and particularly for me. But what he finds is eventually he falls back into his old way of doing things anyway. And he finds he hasn't been sort of made perfect in love in that way. And so he kind of then begins to push back on that Moravian mentality in the sense that he says, well, just because you're saved doesn't mean you should stop pursuing holiness, right? You want to do some things to sort of keep your heart right and actually pursue sanctification, holiness, looking like Jesus. And so he says, yeah, you need to be saved by faith, but then there are the appropriate responses of living a Christian life. And we'll talk more about that. Any questions on that? Let me check my notes. Okay. Let's talk about then the structure of the movement John and Charles found out of Wesley's experience. These were called the United Societies, eventually called the Methodists. But, like I said, they are not founding a church. They gather in sometimes for corporate worship, but the sacraments would still be at an Anglican church. You'd still be a member of those churches. This was a movement, kind of an extra movement from the church. And the way it was structured is, the main structure was not a gathering of worship, but a class meeting. That is, it was a small group in which you would gather and share what sins you committed, what you were being challenged by, what your ways you had, maybe experienced the grace of God. The only thing the one criteria for joining a class meeting was a desire to flee from the wrath to come. Yeah. And then the larger goal is to spread scriptural holiness across the land, right? So this idea we're a movement to try to genuinely be holy. So someone pointed out, I think Thursday night. So the structure is you have these class meetings of 12 people. They're meeting every week with a leader. And like I said, reflecting and talking and going through those things, probably giving alms. I think there's a small payment to be part of the group. And you have a bunch of class meetings. And then all the leaders have a group of leaders that meet. And I think there's actually a third level too. It's multi-level marketing.
The pyramid.
It's a pyramid scheme. But for the goal of larger social holiness. And what would happen practically, and what is still, I think, a really good model for churches, and this is how we plant churches usually, in at least in our conferences, you start with small groups like this. And maybe you start with one, and one person, along with the leader, really shows a growth in faith or a willingness to lead, and you say, well, why don't you go start your own group? Or a couple of people want to join and you're at 12 and you say, well, we'll split into 2 groups of 6, find some more people, and we have this person willing to go lead the new group. And you sort of expand out from there. And along with that, Wesley appoints lay people to be preachers going around helping to oversee the class meetings and make sure the structure's working. And that's where a system of itinerancy comes from. He appoints these people to ride around and preach and teach and then check on how things are going. So this is the structure. This is what they're doing. This is the key feature of Methodism is the class meeting. Charles dies in 1781 and John dies in 1791. He lives a very long time. I think he's late 80s or maybe into his 90s. They die still as part of the Anglican Church. What does happen, I think, interestingly, is, let me find that. We have in the discipline still the general rules. I sometimes repeat them: do no harm, do good. And there's the little book that says stay in love with God. The real general rule was attend upon all the ordinances of God. which you can see why they found something a little more catchy, or Reuben Job did. But those were kind of the rules to live by. You tried to not sin, and not harm other people, and you tried to do good things, and then you attended upon the ordinances of God. That is, you worshiped, you received the sacraments, you read scripture, you prayed personally and in a group. All of these different things were basically the rules of the societies. And you can read the whole section about the United Society. But where was I going with this? Each society is divided into smaller companies called classes according to their respective places of abode. There are about 12 persons in a class, one of whom is styled the leader. It is their duty to see each person in his class once a week at least, to inquire how their souls prosper, to advise, reprove, comfort, or exhort as occasion may require, and to receive what they are willing to give toward the relief of the preachers, church, and poor. To meet the ministers and stewards of the society once a week in order to inform the minister of any that are sick, or of any that walk disorderly and will not be reproved, and to pay the stewards what they have received of their several classes in the week preceding. So this is, you had these meetings, and then you had the leaders of the church, these ministers traveling around, and the leader would check on everyone in the group, and they'd meet, and then would talk to the minister about what was going on, if anyone was sick or needed help or whatever, and then would give the offering that they gave. The other thing they did was what we might call acts of social justice, giving widows a place to sew garments so they could actually make a living, giving people small loans, right, where someone who would never be able to go to a bank and get a loan could get a small loan, housing certain people and visiting prisoners, these kinds of things. Like I said, there is only one condition previously required of those who desire admission into these societies, a desire to flee from the wrath to come and to be saved from their sins. But wherever this is really fixed in the soul, it will be shown by its fruits. So, the point I was making by turning to this page is part of doing no harm is avoiding evil of every kind, which includes the taking of the name of the Lord in vain, profaning the day of the Lord, so you're supposed to keep Sabbath, but then also drunkenness, buying or selling spirituous liquors, slaveholding, buying or selling slaves, fighting, quarreling, brawling, brother going to law with brother, returning evil for evil, or railing for railing, the using of many words in buying and selling. You can't commit usury, all these things, right? What this means historically, and also, by the way, he says, well, the putting on of gold and costly apparel. This is such an interesting list I could spend. But then the singing those songs or reading those books which do not tend to the knowledge or love of God. John Wesley would not be happy when I pick up the guitar and sing John Prine on Sunday. He would not like that.
He wouldn't like Reacher either.
No, he wouldn't like some of the books we read either.
Reacher's my man.
Yeah.
Well, can I ask,
No, yeah.
Can
Yeah.
I ask a question?
Yeah.
All right, you got the tier. Way back when, we had charge.
Yeah.
We had like Salem, Phillips Chapel, and our
Oh.
church was on a charge.
Mm-hmm.
Now I don't know if that was structured after this, and we had a district superintendent, of course, and one minister served 3 churches.
We're gonna get there.
Oh.
No, but you know what the organizing event of our single church is every year? It's still called Charge Conference.
Oh yeah.
Technically, I still have a charge. My charge is just one church.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's actually, it's a big historical change, which we're gonna get to. But, well, the joke I always make is when they stopped circuit riding, because, initially a circuit, you'd have 12 or more places on your circuit, you'd see your church once a quarter.
Well, that's why we only
Yeah.
had preachers once,
yeah.
almost once a month.
But so the thing about that is, when you locate a pastor, even in 1 or 2 churches in one place for several years, or in one place for many years, it changes the job, because a circuit rider only had to have 1 sermon every quarter.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You had one that you got really good at, versus the expectation of writing a new sermon every week, it's a totally different job then. Because that's, I mean, depending on how well you do it, you should spend a lot of time working on that sermon every week. And so, anyway, but we're going to get there. But it is very much based on this structure. That's, the organizing events of the church are conferences. And it sort of is structured in a similar way, even though a lot has changed since then. So, the historical point I was going to make before we talk some theological things is, when you think of that list, what happens as Methodism becomes a bigger and bigger movement is business owners realize it's a good idea to hire a Methodist because they're not going to get drunk and not show up for work. They're not going to be engaged in all sorts of terrible activities. They're dependable people. And so what you have is, early on, it is a very lower class movement or a very working class movement. Even as Wesley's life goes on, Methodists become higher status because they become people you can trust to employ. And so if you look at his sermons later in his life, he writes a lot of sermons more about things like the use of money, things like how to use your sort of influence in that way. You can almost see kind of his direction turn a little bit to addressing the concerns once the people he's leading maybe have a little more power and how to use that. I mean, he becomes extremely famous and has to deal with then his influence and the influence he has over the people. Okay, let's talk a little bit of the sort of key theological concepts that we sort of get from Wesley, or the big points of emphasis I want to make. The first one, where do I want to start? Well, I want to start with, have y'all heard the language of justification and sanctification?
Yes.
Justification is the word for when you get saved. Through the grace of God, you experience faith in Jesus Christ in your heart, and through that you are granted eternal life through his reconciling death and resurrection. You don't have to have your heart strangely warmed one day. It doesn't have to be an altar call, but you do have to have faith in Jesus Christ. I mean, we could talk about what exactly that means, but justification is that moment of salvation which you do by no work of your own, right? Is simply by faith. Sanctification is then the growing in the love of God and neighbor, and involves then good works. Wesley is one of the most important thinkers historically in all of Christianity on the connection between these two. Because it is very important to understand you are saved by faith, but it is also very important to understand that faith leads to good works. That we just need faith to be saved, but there is a necessary response to faith, which is work, which is good works in that sense, and also the pursuit of holiness. Martin Luther famously says the epistle of James is an epistle of straw, because James says faith without works is dead. Wesley loves James. He thinks it's really important because it gets at this connection. And he writes, half the sermons in that sermon book are about this. The other thing he actually believes in is something called perfection, which is very unique to Wesleyan traditions. This is the idea that in this life, through sanctification, through the grace of God, you can be made perfect. Now, we're all mortal, and so you can still sin because you didn't understand something or as a mistake. But he says, in this life, if you attend to your prayers and your good works and read your Bible and all stuff, you can achieve perfect love of God and perfect love of neighbor. That is, you could never intentionally sin, that your heart would be perfectly pure. One of the questions they ask of people entering the process of ordination is, do you expect to be made perfect in this life? and we're supposed to say yes. I will say yes. The other question, it's all a bunch of yeses, and the one no is, are you so in debt as to embarrass yourself? And you say no, and then you say, but you made me go to Duke. There's a big range of what that could be. But the thing to emphasize about perfection is he also says if someone perfectly loved God and perfectly loved their neighbor, they would never claim that, right? If you reach perfection, you would never admit it, basically. And so it's kind of something you believe in and sort of...
Which would feel like bragging, which would be a sin.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
You would never brag like that. And so, yeah. So you could only speculate on who that might be. But it is important. The animating force behind the Methodist movement is an understanding of social holiness. That is, that we grow in faith and that the Holy Spirit works in a special way in the engagement of believers. That is, you need a community to grow in faith. You can say, I'm spiritual and not religious, but unless you have some people who help you to be spiritual, there's not much to that, and it's very easy to just fall back into whatever. You need people to keep you honest to grow. I mean, social holiness is, we need one another. And that's the class meetings, right? You need a group of people who you're meeting with and commiserating with and confessing to in order to grow in holiness. This is why we do things by conferences, because we believe the Holy Spirit works in the interaction of believers. This is a huge, this is what animates the whole movement, social holiness. Oh boy, I gotta get moving here. Okay. Okay. The next one is free will. What?
It's a mouthful there.
Yeah.
Free will.
Free will.
Thing of it.
Free will is a huge Christian problem that people disagree on and fight about. I can't remember my Calvinist doctrines, but Calvinism is extremely, not the fully extreme end, but a Calvinist belief is a belief in predestination, which mostly means salvation. But the idea is, you can understand, if you believe in an all-powerful God, how can there be anything God doesn't know or that God didn't will? And if that's the case, then how can we also have free will, right? It's a real problem if you believe in the all-powerful God. There's a few ways people have found around this. There's double predestination, which just says God knew all this was going to happen, including Adam and Eve were going to sin, and God willed it this way because there's a greater justice or righteousness found in falling into sin and being saved, or something like that. There's also a single predestination, which is God gave Adam and Eve free will, they used it wrong, and so now we don't have free will anymore. We're sort of stuck in sin. The other thing predestination means is basically God knows who's going to heaven and who's not. And if God has always known that and knew it, from a free will perspective, that means that God damns some people, right? That's a Calvinist perspective would maybe say, but you can't know which one you are, and God is ultimately graceful, but humans sin, something like that. Wesley has 2 points, I think. And I may be summarizing some more recent theology, but I think it's in there. The first is, God's power does not work like human power. Maybe if I were a king, I would just tell everyone what to do and demand they do it and run people like robots. But maybe God is so powerful as to give people free will, to make people in God's own image and give them choices.
Yeah.
Maybe God is that gracious. The other thing about that is we would still believe, even with a belief in free will, that humanity now is inherently sinful. And so to actually make a free choice or to choose what is right, you need God's help. We don't think everyone just has free will initially. We believe that through baptism and God's prevenient grace, you are given the ability to make free choices, right? That's such a dense theological topic that I'm trying to summarize. But it's not just that everyone's born and you either choose to be good or choose to be bad, but that everyone is sinful, and with God's help, we can choose to be good. The other thing Wesley says about this, along with just believing in a God who could make people in God's image and help them have free will, he fights with George Whitefield about this. George Whitefield, the first Great Awakening in American history, preached these big crowds and stuff, you might remember. Whitefield was a Methodist. He was part of the Holy Club, but he was also a Calvinist. And so he writes a sermon to him called Free Grace. And I think the other point Wesley sort of makes very subtly is, even if everything is destined and we don't have free will, you shouldn't tell people that. Right? That even if we don't have free will, you should act like you do. Right? You should act like your choices matter, and as leaders in the church, we should teach people that their choices matter. This isn't always the case, but if you're taught that it's predestined and whoever gets into heaven is established before you're born and whoever gets into hell is established before you're born, what's the point in doing anything? Now, there are Calvinist answers to that, but Wesley's saying, if you preach predestination, you're going to make a lot of people hopeless. And so there is a pastoral reason to tell people they have free will, along with actually believing we have free will with God's help. It's an important distinction. And even if most Sundays our worship looks a lot like the Presbyterian church down the road, theologically there is a difference there.
So free will is only good?
When we talk about free will, we emphasize the good because we believe human sinfulness prevents us from choosing what's good. Does that? How can I describe this? Without God's help, we believe everyone would sort of just choose evil, choose selfishness, and things like that.
Go with your basic,
Yeah.
your base
Yeah.
instinct.
Some people might see that as free, but there's no freedom in just choosing to go with your basic instinct, right? The real freedom is maybe choosing to give yourself for others, right? And that's where God helps, right? So it's kind of like you have a limited vision and God opens it up, right? And so that's where we talk. I mean, these are dense philosophical things. So
Okay.
Genuine free will, we emphasize the good because you need God's help to get there, and so God is restoring the free will through grace in someone. And Wesley actually says that could happen before someone knows God because of prevenient grace. So someone who isn't yet faithful might be able to do something. Someone who doesn't know Jesus can still help someone who's poor, right? But you
That's
can.
going to be my next question.
But you can only do it for the right reasons if you know Jesus,
Okay.
right? And that's I still have sort of mixed feelings about that, but Wesley would say God still helped you do that even if you don't know God yet. So, yeah. But there are some people who would say, yeah, you could do that, but it doesn't count at all. And of course, none of it counts because we're saved by faith. But yeah, yeah. But you would say there is a tangible difference between feeding a hungry person out of your faith in Jesus Christ versus doing it before. I mean, there's a faith difference there, even if it's all good and God is at work in anything like that. I think this is one of the things we could spend like 8 weeks on, as you can tell. And could spend years on. People have written, 1,000,000-page books about that. And like I said, I'm running through this stuff, so I didn't get a chance to refresh everything. Okay, I talked about the general rules. The one other theological emphasis I want to point out is what I would call practical holiness. When Calvin wants to tell you what he believes about Jesus, he writes a big book called the Institutes, I think. A big, long book that no one who isn't forced to read reads. John Wesley didn't write a big book. He wrote a bunch of sermons and notes on the New Testament and letters to people, and Charles Wesley wrote hymns. In other words, they wrote things about God that people might actually read. Things that can actually be... The big books are important. I'm not saying they're not. But they wrote things that normal people could maybe learn from and come to understand God through. And apply. That's right. And look, Charles Wesley is sometimes underemphasized because he mostly wrote hymns. But there's an argument that he's more important to this whole thing than John is. Because those hymns... you can sing hymns if you don't know how to read. Right? And so that is a really important way to teach people, and maybe we need it today too, where people can't or don't read. You can teach them a lot about God if you teach someone to sing Hark the Herald Angels Sing, right? Or Love Divine, All Love's Excelling, or one of those. I mean, those are dense poems about faith that you can teach someone and that will stick in their head because it's a song. I mean, that's really important. And sermons are the same way, that they're meant to be delivered and to capture something in a style that someone could hear, that's brief enough that people might actually engage with it.
But more people know the hymns than read the sermons.
Yeah. And probably more people know the hymns than understand any sermon, in the sense that you sing hymns throughout your life. And you know... That's a good point. Yeah, I got the choir here. But it is. I mean, this is something that still exists in some ways, but I think is important. Is until pretty recently, people who were famous theologians were usually also pastors. The people who were doing the biblical scholarship were usually ordained. One of the great biblical scholars of the 19th century is Raymond Brown, who was a Jesuit priest. One of the great, and there's many like that. And I think that helps in some ways because you're actually connecting those things. Whereas now, it is easy to become a theologian and maybe go to church on Sunday, but you're in the school learning and reading the smart things, and you're disconnected from the life of the church and the way we live faith out. And that's why I'm glad my smartest classmate is a pastor. So that's important. Oh, the other piece of practical holiness is John Wesley and Methodist preached outside. The itinerant. That was not common or popular. And there's the famous story, I'd have to look it up, but he's not allowed to preach in the church where he grew up, and so he goes out and preaches on his father's grave. Preaching outside is a big deal. and is going to be a big deal when the movement gets translated to the American continent, where you don't have a lot of buildings yet. But really important, by the way, because if you're outside, there's a chance someone might actually hear you who's didn't already plan to be there. Revivals, tent meetings, all come out of that too. The other thing I've been mentioning, I mentioned community service and the general rules. The other thing that goes all the way back to Wesley is the trust clause. It's still in here. I looked it up last time. Let's see if I can remember. 2502. 2503. Except in conveyances that require that the real property so conveyed shall revert to the grantor if and when its use as a place of divine worship has been terminated, all written instruments of conveyance by which the premises are held or hereafter acquired for use as a place of divine worship or other activities for members of the United Methodist Church shall contain the following trust clause. In trust, that said premises shall be used, kept, and maintained as a place of divine worship of the United Methodist Ministry and members of the United Methodist Church, subject to the discipline, usage, and ministerial appointments of said church as from time to time, blah, blah, blah. In trust that all such premises shall be held, kept, and maintained as a place of residence for the use and occupancy of, oh, this is the parsonage. Here's the good stuff. All properties are held in trust for the benefit of the entire denomination, and ownership and usage of church property is subject to the discipline. This goes back to Wesley. When someone wanted to donate a building for the Methodists to worship at, you had to ask, well, what if someone makes them mad? Can they just kick us all out one day? Or what if someone lets us use a building and then at night they decide to have a casino in there, or a brothel, or a bar, right? Well, you can't have that. And so you have a trust clause that says this building is held in trust for the Methodists, and it shall, its use shall operate within the provisions of the discipline. That's why you get in trouble if you have a raffle.
I told you about that.
I know, you told us. The DS came and said you can't do that. That's why we don't have drinking in the church. There are Episcopalian churches that pop champagne on Christmas Eve. We don't do that. And you heard, you refrain from drunkenness, right? This is important theologically, because no church building just belongs to the people who are there. It belongs to God, right? And because we have a connection with other churches, it's not just about us. We are in a connection with a larger conference and a bigger church. And so what this practically means today really is we have to abide by those provisions in the discipline. And if a church closes, the property is then held by the conference, and the conference decides what to do with it. Technically, can the conference come in and, they can say you can't have a raffle, and there are provisions whereby they'll sort of, theoretically the conference could come in and say you've got to close, but they're not going to do that unless the church is never paying apportionments and is, so in debt that, the church is going to fall apart or be repossessed. They're not just going to come in and do that. This is what this was the selling point for disfiliation.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to buy the church. Who's we?
Yeah.
Because, sincerely, people say that as if the conference is always coming in and, demanding things. Really, all the conference does is send you a preacher. And maybe sometimes you could be mad about that. But they do a lot of, anyway. But the bigger point, to me, my question was always, yeah, okay, your church is no longer held in trust for the denomination. If the church closes, you can't just pay out everyone who's left. It's a nonprofit. Your property and your assets have to go to another nonprofit anyway. That's how, anyway, so the bigger point is this goes back to Wesley. This is as traditional as Methodism gets. I just think it's ironic. It's fine. The church that is claiming to be the most traditional, to hold on to the tradition, we believe in traditional Christianity, took out something that goes back to Wesley. I'm sure they have a good reason for it and arguments for it, but I want to point out that this is history. And I'm probably not explaining it well. I'm not a lawyer nor an expert on Methodism, but it has always been there and it's required to be there.
And the reasons you're giving are good ones.
Well, yeah, how can you have a church if you don't have some way that people are supposed to be abiding by your standards? Now, you can't always enforce them, and that's difficult, but I would want there to be some recourse if I or someone in our church stood up and started saying, Jesus was just a person, and he probably wasn't actually raised from the dead. If someone started teaching heresy, you would want some method to say, okay, you can believe that, but that's not appropriate in this place, right? So saying, your church has to abide by the discipline, it's not just raffles, it's, and there certainly are pastors who maybe have said things that were against some provision in the book, but how can you have a church if you don't have some witness to the connection? And a witness to the fact that we're bigger than just this church.
And that model has served other denominations well too. I don't know about the Baptist church, but it works exactly the same way in a couple other churches and events.
Yeah, and certainly Catholic churches.
Yeah.
But then Lutheran churches they have some trust clause for the synod.
Yeah. Everything is.
And it was.
Yeah.
The reason they made a disaffiliation provision was this was a huge mess when the Anglican Episcopalian Church split. There's two Church of England churches in the U.S. now, basically over the line of gay clergy, really. And it was a huge fight over who got which building, and it was, legal cases that dragged on for 30 years. So, we could talk more about, okay. So,
We'll grant you a little extra time.
thank you. We're still in Britain, folks. Yeah. So the one other thing I want to say that the U.S., the American Christians inherit is, along with the general rules, we have articles of religion that are pretty closely copied from the Anglican Church has 39 articles. We have 25. I don't know which ones they took out. But these are your statements in here that are your basic theological concepts. The Trinity, who Jesus Christ is, what is the church, what are the sacraments, do we believe in so we have basic statements here that would maybe be an interesting study on their own that are those sort of basic theological statements. Because of the practical holiness, I always say the Methodist catechism is the hymnal, but that's about as close as we get otherwise. And if you look at the hymnal, it's structured like a systematic theology, like one of those smart books. It starts with God and moves through it. So, okay, so people start. Well, there were already people here, but Europeans started settling in North America. And especially on this side of the country, Methodists and Baptists are the huge religions that benefit or that expand and explode in membership because they employ circuit riders. When the Anglicans or Catholics tried to plant, they'd say, well, we'll build our church here and this is where people can worship. And what would happen is it takes a few years to build a church, and the settlers are already 20 miles west, and even the people who were there probably already started going to a camp meeting or hearing from a circuit rider and already then had a community they were already part of. There were also not very many priests of the Anglican or Catholic denominations, and the Methodists had already had a history of itinerant and lay preachers. And so even as they eventually ordain people so that people can receive the sacraments, they already had a bunch of ministers out there doing the thing that weren't waiting to go through the whole education process before they were out preaching the gospel. And so, I mean, that you can see how that would allow you to expand. If all you need is a horse and your Bible, you can be riding all over to the smallest little tiny towns before there's much of anything there. And if you're a small town in the middle of nowhere, the Methodists or the Baptists, at least with circuit riders, and even later, because we have an appointment system, the Methodists will make sure you have a pastor. They'll send someone there. I mean, that's an important thing historically, that some churches became Methodist just because they'd actually send you someone and you didn't have to find someone to be the preacher. This is where, again, also preaching outdoors, these things. The big thing that happens is Wesley allows them to form their own religion, or their own denomination at that time, because of the break, because of the lack of priests. And he says, okay, I'm going to send you a couple bishops. I'm going to send you Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke. You probably actually pronounced it Cook. That's where we get Cokesbury from. But you can tell the American spirit, because when they come over and say, well, John said we're going to be your leaders, all the people in America said, okay, but we're going to vote on it. Yeah, before that time, bishops were consecrated, but they were basically decided by leadership. We elect bishops. It's a very American thing. And so you do still have class meetings. Now they're having Sunday worship as well, but a requirement of membership in Methodism was you were a member of a class meeting. You had your small group. And so Francis Asbury, famously, we have his journals, would ride all the way through all 13 colonies, with the seasons from Maine all the way down here and through Georgia, and all the way back every year. He'd ride that circuit once a year, overseeing what was happening. And that's partially why you have so many churches named Asbury, because he went through a lot of those places. And I'm sure there's records of him in Hillsborough. I don't know about other places around here. I should have looked. Let's see, what else? So when you're transplanted, I mean, Wesley was already doing conferences. He was already organizing the group by having conferences. He was still the boss. And the American version really was much more democratic, where it really was a vote, and really worked along those lines as conferences went, but they still have conferences. So the Methodists are expanding with all this, and the big thing that really starts to happen then is you start to get some fracturing off from the movement. The holiness tradition, Pentecostalism, Nazarenes, a lot of these traditions spring off from Methodism. They're the sort of enthusiastic ends where you have records at this time, people are chanting and yelling and screaming in worship and stuff, and a lot of those elements some of them go off to form their own denominations. The theological difference there is usually a sense of entire sanctification. So they believe in perfection, but they sort of treat it as a second version of justification. You're saved by faith, and then in another experience, the Holy Spirit's poured out on you, and you're fully holy then. And they speak in tongues sometimes and other things like that. That's one break off. The other break you have is not entirely, but for the most part, your Black Methodist break off. AME, AMEZ, CME. I have an account in that big book by Richard Allen, who founded the AME. He was a freed slave. His master, actually, or his owner, or I don't know what the right nomenclature in the present is, the person who said he owned him became a Methodist and decided it was unethical to have slaves. So he freed them, but he did make them pay for their freedom, which was always an interesting thing to me, that you've decided this is morally wrong, but you still sort of need payment for it. Richard Allen travels with Asbury. He becomes a very popular preacher, but they're really wary about letting him be a leader. They're certainly not going to ordain him. And he says, I want to start buy a building and start a class meetings and things just for black people and freed slaves. They say, no, you can't do that. And he starts going to church in, I think it's St. George's. I've been saying it's Philadelphia. I could be wrong. But he is such a good evangelist. Suddenly there's this huge group of black people worshiping in this church. And what happens? But they start to say, well, you all need to sit in the balcony, right? Or you all need to sit around the edges. And the account in there, this is his writing, is the trustees of the church decided they needed to sit in a different place than they'd been sitting. And they decide they're going to move them in the middle of a prayer. So they're on their knees praying, and these trustees are coming up to them and saying, you got to move. And they literally, I mean, by his account, he says, okay, we'll move, but can we finish praying? And they're lifting them up from their knees praying a prayer, and at that point he says, okay, we're done. And tries some other things, but goes and forms his own, their own denomination. I share that story to say, race in America is too big a topic, but these things weren't just, well, they're happier over there and we're happier over here. I mean, people made that happen. Usually because of prejudices like that and all sorts of things. But it is a shame, I think, probably for the long term, that even today, we're still pretty segregated.
The Presbyterian Church
Mhm.
in all fields,
Yeah,
that's
the
what the
balcony.
balcony was for, was for the blacks
Mhm.
and the slaves.
Yeah. So that's a big split. Those denominations still exist, or still connected in some ways, but not are their own denomination. The other split that happens about 30 years before the Civil War, the Methodist Church splits north and south. Because there was this Methodist history that owning slaves was a sin. Some people in the South didn't like that, and so you basically have two tracks that are fairly similar in their disciplines, but one has the part about slaveholding and one doesn't. There's actually a third branch called the Methodist Protestants. I think Cedar Cliff was a Methodist Protestant church. They, if my memory serves, they split because they wanted not just to elect bishops, but they wanted bishops to only serve a term and then go back to being a normal clergy person. Even going with history, in our church now, you're elected a bishop, but when you're made a bishop, you're a bishop. There's no not being it's a lifetime office, even if we have a retirement age and things like that. So they split over that, and eventually they're all going to come together. The other thing I have to mention is there are a great number of German immigrants to the U.S., more influenced maybe by Moravian tradition and things like that. But when they come over and start to write their discipline, they're very influenced by the Methodist movement, that when they have to write their sort of doctrines, they actually just make a German copy of the Methodist one. It's a good list. What that means is, and I think this was more a thing sort of in my neck of the woods, but in the U.S. you had English Methodists and German Methodists. and especially until German really fell out of popularity. I mean, German was the second most spoken language in the U.S. until after World War I. So you had German Methodists along with the English Methodists, the Methodist Episcopal Church, and the German Methodists, and they were called like the Evangelical Association, the United Brethren, are the big ones. Eventually, these are all the churches that are coming together to form the United Methodist Church. Before that, by the end of the 1800s, the Methodist Church does away with mandatory class meetings. That's a big change. I mean, that goes all the way back to Wesley, and then that's really the moment when they become sort of just like every other mainline denomination, in that you no longer have that basic unit of your small group meeting. What really replaces it is Sunday school. Sunday school is a huge historical movement, especially around that sort of industrialization time, where you have all these structures, where you have they even build churches around it, where you have your central meeting room and all the classes on the outside. You'll still see churches like this. And you have your structure of Sunday school for each age group. Sunday school is great. It's a really important way that we all, I think, learned a lot about the faith. But there's a real difference between a group meeting to grow in faith, to commiserate, to sort of gather socially, versus gathering a group designed around instruction, right? It sort of almost is one's up here and one's down here. And it's a big difference. Not necessarily good or bad, but a huge historical change. Also, so into the beginning of the 20th century, there evolved something called the social gospel. This sense that, especially post-industrialization, the church exists to reform the world, and in doing so, there's actually a belief that the church, through its work of reforming society, will bring about Christ's return by sort of bringing that new heaven and new earth. I mean, it's that big. But it's an orientation towards social justice. The big thing is the temperance movement. I mean, Methodists, especially, Methodist women especially, were right at the forefront of getting prohibition passed. And then also things like ending child labor. I mean, you all know the history. You have these big factories, and Lee was telling me even at the mill here, the kids would, they would send kids to bring lunches to the workers. These kids are walking through a working mill with these machines running and stuff. I mean, even that, there would be...
I had to carry lunch.
Really? And even that, there is no way today. They would have all sorts of OSHA rules about, you cannot have a child anywhere near this building or on this floor, right? You have hard hat rules and all sorts of stuff. I mean, all that, and along with a 2-day weekend and the 40-hour work week, are manifestations of the labor movement of the early 20th century, and Methodists are a huge driver of that. I mean, you have Methodist bishops. Francis McConnell writes a whole chapter in his book about striking with the steel workers in 1918, and sort of being right there on the picket line. And this is 1918, so they're getting hosed down and beaten up and all this stuff. The social gospel loses a little bit of steam after World War I. It's hard to be optimistic about society reforming when people have just, slaughtered each other in the hundreds of thousands for very little discernible reason. It still goes on, but just ending child labor and a commitment to that, they developed at that time the social creed that helped end child labor, and we still have a section in the discipline called the social principles that go over all sorts of social issues. I mean, you have in here, protection of the environment. There's a statement about space and human exploration of space, about, things like marriage, food justice. So they have all these statements that the General Conference composes and puts in the book, not as doctrinal statements. You don't have to agree with these, but they're sort of statements of this is the church's position on these things. And so I found, can I find it? I think Thursday night I found the gambling one. We talked a lot about gambling for some reason. But sort of it was this really nuanced, it's this really nuanced take where it says, it's pretty strong language. I want to find it, that was so interesting. But there's one in here about collective bargaining, right? Gambling. Gambling is a menace to society, deadly to the best interests of moral, social, economic, and spiritual life, destructive of good government and good stewardship. But it goes on to also point out that gambling has been sort of a lifeline for Native American reservations. And to say, there are these statements, because they're composed by this big committee, they're very nuanced and sort of like, well, here's how we feel, but we also should recognize that there's some complications here. I mean, they're very interesting to read. This is something I would love to do a study on one day. And we sort of talked about, Wesley has these strong opinions about what books you should read. And things are maybe a little more complicated than just, no reading Reacher, but having an understanding of there are things in society that can be harmful to some people. Maybe not Reacher. Maybe in some ways. I don't know. I only watched the first season of the show. But
You didn't read the books.
I read the books.
Oh, okay.
I think I read most of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, when it comes to gambling, I don't think that necessarily pure prohibition is the answer, but it helps that the church has a statement like this. Look at...
That would include the library, wouldn't it?
Well, maybe
Or
so.
how about
I think they say that. I think they say the lottery, and certainly, bingo.
It's a form of gambling.
And-
It is.
And maybe it's just fun for some people, but we know it messes with people's lives, and it is destructive of society.
It's addictive.
In the addictive nature, and also just sucking money from people who probably can't. Yeah, that's right.
People can't afford it.
And
are the ones that
so
are doing
I
it.
don't know, what exactly I would do, but it is. The church should have an opinion on it, and I think we need to recognize that especially the sports gambling that just opened up, and that has been open in the rest of the country for a while in many places. That is it's gonna siphon money from people, but also it's gonna ruin the sports. I'm telling you. That's a side thing, but look at Shohei Ohtani. Anyway, that's a.
Player props.
Yeah.
First time I ever went to Las Vegas, Dillard was, of course, the treasurer, and he would always kid me about, and they'd know, the church would know I was out gambling, and I said, what'd you do, put it on the marquee that I'm in Las Vegas? And so, first time I went, and came back, and Dillard was kidding me, and I said, Dillard, I lost your money, because he was treasurer. I lost my money, and I lost God's money. So he never let me forget that.
So, let's spend a minute. I'm making pretty good time compared to last time. So, what happens kind of out of the social gospel is you have this movement towards the merging of churches. North and South and Protestant come together. I think North and South, it's 36, and then the Protestants are added in 40. And as that's happening, the German Methodists are combining up and sort of settling their discipline things. Until in 1968, they all merged together into the United Methodist Church. That's why it's called United Methodist. There were actually, I didn't realize that until I learned the history. This was a movement globally, and especially in the West, where they really thought, well, a few years from now, we'll merge with the Anglicans, and then we'll merge with the Presbyterians and the Lutherans, and we'll end up with one Protestant church in America. And they did it in Canada. In Canada, they have the United Church of Canada, which was the Methodists and Anglicans, and I think it was the Anglicans. Canada's weird, but it was Methodist, Presbyterians, a whole bunch of these little smaller Protestant denominations came together, and they have the United Church of Canada. We sort of stopped with the Methodists. We can't agree on things like communion and baptism and all sorts of. We're still working on a shared communion agreement with the Episcopalians, and they've been, and the Lutherans, by the way. You think it would be, well, and there are a few churches that have like they're trying to work on a theological agreement so I could go preside at the table in an Anglican church. And they gotta fight over something. They can't quite get something straight so that's what happened. But, so that's where the United Methodist Church has sort of ended up. And I can't cover a lot of the recent history, but I want to talk a minute about then the structure of the church that was set up. It is a global church, but there's not conferences in every places. There are independent Methodist churches in a lot of places in South America. There's a few I went to Bolivia, and Bolivia has United Methodist churches, but a lot of them have their own. But there's a lot of churches in the Philippines, a lot in Africa, and certain places in Europe, Germany especially, where there are United Methodist churches. The basic structure is you have a bunch of local churches, and each local church is part of a charge conference. Even though we're one church, our organizing event is the charge conference, because we believe that that act of social holiness of conferencing is a special way to organize the church. And so every year the church is organized, the leaders are appointed, salaries approved. What else do we do at charge conference? Not that much. By the charge conference. That does go back to when you would maybe have a bigger charge. And I imagine when there were circuit riders, it would be the whole. And they would have quarterly conferences then also where you'd celebrate communion as well. But so we have a bunch of charge conferences. Each church or charge gathers in their charge conference to sort of organize the work of the local church that year. Like I said, salaries, committees, who has the power to make decisions for the rest of the year. Those are divided up into districts, just so someone can be overseeing those areas. And then basically above that you have the annual conference. How am I going to draw this? Annual conference is half clergy and half laity. That's easy in our church. Pat and I go. The problem you run into, well, some churches have 2 pastors. Well, you bring 2 laity. The problem is there are retired pastors. There are district superintendents who don't serve a church. There are people who are clergy, but they serve as hospital chaplains. So actually, we have to do lay equalization. So some churches bring whole crews of people because you need to balance out all the clergy who aren't serving at church. But the annual conference is half and half. And it is overseen by a bishop. Some bishops oversee multiple annual conferences. Usually smaller ones like Minnesota and the Dakotas have one. And for a while during COVID, you were sharing several because they couldn't appoint new bishops. Or elect and consecrate. Annual conference also, oversees ministries in their area, things like camps. Ours does some funding for the Methodist home, and then funds ministry over all the churches. We have an office of new faith communities that will help plant churches or help churches support someone who's trying to plant a church in their area. You have, offices that then oversee clergy life. You have the Board of Ordained Ministry, which examines and ordains clergy, all these kind of structures. And so we talk about the conference doing things. The conference meets once a year, and Pat and I vote on everything technically, but we're also approving someone to be the conference treasurer and deal with the books, someone to, oversee these things. And the bishop makes the appointments of clergy as well.
Although most of the time those votes are by raising your hand and nobody counts them.
Well, yeah, if it's close, they will do a count, and it takes forever, and sometimes they have to do it twice because someone messed up. But there is a lot of just sort of rubber stamping things. But it is a conference in the sense that you follow Robert's rules. Anyone can speak. You can make an amendment, and things like the conference treasurer can come and the finance committee can say, we're going to raise the minimum salary by 3%. Mm-hmm. The annual conference could change that. And they tried last year. Someone said, well, let's make it 3.5%. I mean, you can edit anything because the annual conference is the actual deciding body. And so this is where it gets complicated, because for years and years, the conference has tried to eliminate the status of student pastor, not to eliminate student pastors, but because they have a separate salary tier, and it's higher than regular part-time, and so it's pricing out even part-time churches from, but so many people, because it's half clergy, so many people were student pastors that they want to keep arguing for that to exist. And so they propose it every year. I think they stopped last year because we had the argument every year. But the annual conference will vote it down or change something. This year, because of disaffiliations, they proposed cutting the funding of the camps and Methodist home, because those things have their own fundraising. Camps charge admission and can fund it. And people stood up and said, no, we want to fund it. And so that increased the conference budget, which increased our apportionments by some amount. The conference can do that. They decide the budget. And actually our conference does it pretty well, where you write the budget, you raise the money, and then you adjust the budget based on how much money you raised. But yeah, so I mean, it's a messy system in some ways. From the annual conference, this is the basic unit where, like, technically my membership is in the annual conference. I'm not a member of this church, I'm a member of the annual conference. It's kind of that basic unit. And actually all appointed pastors are, while a lay pastor is serving under appointment. From there, each annual conference elects, how am I going to draw this? Pretend these are annual conferences now. Each annual conference elects delegates to general conference and also actually to jurisdictional conferences. All half and half. All have to be, I think, by 75% vote, so you take vote after vote after vote until you establish certain people. Clergy vote on clergy, laity vote on laity. The jurisdictional conferences, like ours is the Southeast, and you have the Northeast and the North Central, and the outside of the U.S., they're called central conferences. They have similar functions, but central conferences can do a little more with, like, adjusting educational requirements and some translation of the discipline, because they're international. I think we should give them more power personally to maybe make some area-specific rules, but people really don't like that. The main thing they do, really, is elect bishops, consecrate the bishops, and there's something else. And then they do the bishop appointing. You elect the bishops, and they also tell the bishop where they're going to be serving within the jurisdiction. That's sort of the big role of these. And then the general conference, like I said, is actually elected from annual conferences. It's not the pyramid in that way, where you elect them out of here. The general conference, more or less, they write the discipline. There are certain things in here, like those articles, are basic theological statements, the core beliefs and principles that can only be changed by a 60% vote of each annual conference. It's like a constitutional amendment in the U.S. There are certain things they can't really touch, or they have to go through a lot of work to touch. But other than that, they make the rules about what do you need to do to be ordained, what are the committees and who's on them, what are the rules for clergy, everything else that's in this book. They write the social principles, talk about, funding of various operations and boards and things like that. And then, establish rules for clergy, like I said. What else was I going to say about that? They also pass a lot of resolutions, which are not binding, but are more sort of statements of guidance, like, we affirm this, we support that. And that book of resolutions, I don't even have a copy. It's like this, because they sunset eventually, but they write them for 20-year periods or something. Annual conferences meet every year. General conference usually meets every 4 years, unless there's a pandemic. And they can call a special one like they did in 2019. Jurisdictional conferences actually meet generally after general conferences, for rules reasons and things like that.
It's
So,
almost political, isn't it?
well, it is because also, I mean, you have
The government.
well, you have the bishops and the council of bishops. They don't. By the way, bishops don't vote in general conference. They don't actually have a say in what happens. So you basically appoint the people you think are the best leaders, and then they don't get a say. What they do is preside over the proceedings, right? So a certain bishop will, call the people to speak and rule on points of law and things like that. But they're sort of the executive branch in that way, although they have, in my opinion, way less power than they should. Frankly, I think if we trust these people to lead all these things, I think they should vote more, or we should listen to them more, maybe. But you also do have, from General Conference, a judicial council, like the Supreme Court, where they can say, well, General Conference passed this rule, is this allowed? Or, this annual conference decided to do this or that, is that legal for within their parameters, things like that. There are also ways to have a church trial. I don't remember if that's the judicial council or a separate entity, but it's very expensive either way. So yeah, I mean, it's very political, and this is how we do things because we believe in social holiness, but it's messy. I mean, if any of you have watched it, you got 800 or 1,000 people who all have a right to voice and a right to make amendments and all this stuff. I find it frustrating to watch. I can't imagine trying to be there. But this is how we govern, how we establish, and this is the only entity, by the way, that can speak as the United Methodist Church. Sometimes a headline will say United Methodist Church says, and really a certain bishop said it, or a certain annual conference passed a resolution that said it, but this is the only entity. And it's complicated because they only meet once every 4 years. So
This is why I say everybody should go to conference one time.
just to see it and see how the sausage is made, definitely.
It gives you so much more of an understanding of how we are more than this building, this community.
And that's exactly right. All these things, I mean, it is a little bit messy, but it's, you go to annual conference and you get a sense that there's churches all over this half of the state, where ours is half the state, doing all sorts of things. And you get a sense of it in the sense that we're through our apportionments, our funding, part of something bigger. And so when you're connected to this, you do get that sense that the church is, bigger than just us here. And that's comforting to me. Anything else? Oh, 90 minutes, there we go.
There's no test, straight.
True and false. No. No, and like I said, when you're covering this much this quickly, it just things become very general. But I just want a sense of how things work, how things are voted on, and how we got this way. Anything else? I'll turn off the live stream then. No.